we were talking a little bit about funding through the SCORE grant process. And so could you talk a little bit about that? And then also, Ms. Juniman had talked, and I think that the usual initial thought is that, well, we don't want a consultant, we'll just have staff do some stuff. And so I think that it's important that we have a little bit of discussion about how busy staff is and you know, whether or not we think that essentially it would be more expensive or less expensive to have a consultant. Now, granted, if we have a consultant, we're going to have a line item for paying that person versus the you know, the weekly paychecks. But I mean, how much time are we going to ask staff to take away from the other things that we have them doing? And so one SCORE grant, and then if there's any comments about how piled up the work is and whether or not, you know, there's enough time for our existing staff to do this, and if they do, you know, has anybody given any thought to how many hours we're going to have into it and whether or not that actually would cost us more or less than hiring a consultant? So anyone want to take a shot at any of that? SCORE grant, that should be fairly easy.
Mayor and Council, on the SCORE grant, I think either Dewey or Sean can wade in here, but you know, certainly we believe that you know, we went out and checked with consultants. I mean, we're talking about you know, a full-blown study potentially is as much as $60,000, and you know, that would be an entire study. And I think Mr. Nephew talked about some of the, you know, redoing some of the issues, but we're also talking about putting our program together. And so I'm going to segue from that. You know, it's eligible for the SCORE grant, and we think it's there, but you also saw, Council, just a few weeks ago, you were concerned about raising the recycling fee that extensive. And that SCORE grant can go to pay either our cost for our new recycling contract, or it can go to pay for this consultant. You can't use the money in both locations. So, I mean, we're talking about, you know, having to increase those fees for recycling should you choose to go the consultant route. I think if going and asking staff to really get up to speed and become the experts on this, I think Sean and Steve are both really moving along very well and could do a good job. But as I said, this is not something that clearly is something that both of them are going to be dedicating 25 or 30% of their time in 2011 to that task. So we're talking about probably, if we're going to do this at a staff level, really taking a much longer time frame to get you information because of the other duties they have. As Mayor, you suggested maybe there are some things that we simply would put aside and not do. With Mr. Coomer, he's our lead engineer in one of our street projects. So it's probably not feasible at this point in time to do that, but we simply need some of his expertise and involvement in that. With Sean, she's got the environmental planning tasks and roles and lots of items there, but if this is one of the priorities, we would certainly shift some of the things that she's doing and dedicate more of her time. In that case, the expense wouldn't be that much, simply because we would come up with a list of things that either we're not doing or we'd ask some of our other planners to do, and you know, things that the Environmental Commission is also working on. She spends a lot of time on our energy program, and that's been a major program for us to try to get energy reduction and a new energy plan and a new approach to how we can control the energy use and financially reduce those costs for the city. So it's a balancing act. Kind of a long answer, but the fact is, at this point in time, in a short, reasonable time frame, you know, 6 months, for staff to do that, I don't think it's in the cards. I mean, we're talking about, you know, probably, you know, with the type of information studies that we're talking about, it's probably longer than 6 months. With a consultant, obviously, it could be moved along much quicker, but then you're looking at those recycling fund fees going up to the extent that we talked about at our last couple of meetings. I don't know, maybe Dewey, you want to jump in, or Sean, if you had some thoughts.
Mayor, Council, no, I completely agree with Mr. All. Getting back to the score question, the score appropriations can be used, and we did check with the county on that. They can be used to assist the city in paying for this, so that's not an issue. And as council saw at the last staff meeting, the city receives, I think it went up next year. We're set to receive somewhere in the neighborhood of $77,000. So that money, if it's council's desires, can be used to pay for a consultant. And I agree with Mr. All on the other points. It is a very time-consuming process, and if you're asking staff to get something to you on a much quicker pace, there are some things that we wouldn't be able to do. So I completely agree with Chuck in that regard.
Okay. I don't know which one he was
Mine's
first.
related, so-
All right, well, go ahead then.
That would be a part of what would be helpful for me personally, and that is the cost of the question itself, right? In other words, scenario A, this is the time frame for a consultant, this is the cost associated with the consultant, and this is what, how we would pay for it. This is the time frame if the staff did it, this is the cost associated to that, because those are soft costs, but not really, right? I mean, you could have come up with a dollar amount in essence, in terms of time and so on. And then this is where we would get the funding and how we would pay for it. That's part of what, and I think one of the other things that has to be included on both of those is related to, one of the things that we, and I think Mr. Nephew alluded to this too, is how are we getting an opportunity through, again, another soft cost, getting information out to residents and getting feedback from residents. I want to read this piece because this is related. 20 cities have looked at this, as well as Ramsey and Washington counties, Falcon Heights, and so on and so on, have abandoned this. Citizens were overwhelmingly opposed to this. In other words, starting off on the wrong foot because of the National Solid Waste Management Association's information and their strategy and their lobbying group. In one respect, I have a tremendous amount of respect for the group because they're very, very effective in it, right? And that's what they get paid to do. So if we are seeing that as one of the obstacles so that we can correctly and properly inform our residents, what's the cost associated to that? Because we do have almost a campaign to wage against somebody who's waging a campaign against the question. So those are soft costs, but we can come up with that amount, right? So I think in order to ask the question, we ought to have some information about what we're looking at in terms of time, staff, and costs.
Ms. Juniman?
Okay, to clarify, since I started the conversation by saying I wanted staff and not a consultant, I guess you can turn anything into something that takes longer than we're all going to be alive. So we have to decide if that's what we want to do or not. Unfortunately, the history of environmental issues is that way. Let's treat it as a Boy Scout project for 5 or 6 years, and then let's see if it's more serious than a Boy Scout project. And by the way, let's have a task force on that. And then when they give us their result, then let's pull in a consultant to help us decide whether we should do what we've been talking about doing for 10 years. And whether we are going to or not going to do this, I don't see this as a 10-year task. First of all, it's been a 20-year task already. But when I was saying staff to bring us some facts, I guess I was thinking before a resolution of intent to let us know that we're all on the same playing field of knowledge base. And I'm thinking first part of the year, okay? It's already the 15th of November. Could we get real here? But somewhere after the first of the year, so we are looking at basically the programs that loosely have worked, what worked about them, what didn't. I'm not asking them to analyze every neighboring city's program. I'm just saying bring the stuff forward that seems successful, bring the stuff forward that you've heard about that was really a bust. And there are 3 or 4 cities that I'm aware that have pretty solid contracts. Let's look at those, what's in them. And so if staff could bring us those things, so we are looking at that and deciding, that's how we decide whether we want to move forward, if you ask me, as a knowledge base first. And I'm with Mr. Nephew. I really think in theory this sounds wonderful, but you got to see what the reality of it is for different places first, and then see how our reality could work with it. And if in fact it's better service overall for less money, well, duh, it's not brain surgery. But we have to know that that's a fact, and the only way we know that is to see the other programs and see if there's a way to adapt it. And it has nothing to do, zip, zero, nothing to do with the National Solid Waste people, zip, nothing. It has nothing to do with a love affair with your garbage man, nothing. This is about a program that other cities have done successfully that saves their residents money, that also helps meet some environmental goals. That's why I want to look at it. To me, that other stuff isn't there right now. I can appreciate if people think, you know, I'd like to take my garbage man to lunch, but that's not what we're here to do. I like my hauler too. And if we would go to organized collection, there's a fairly strong chance I would get somebody else that I don't like as well. Well, if that's the biggest adjustment I've ever made in my life, lucky me. It isn't about that. It's about, is this a program that would work for this city, and if so, how can we structure it to make it do that? And I don't think we should be looking at 2 years, and I'm not even sure we should be looking at 18 months. I'm thinking we should be able to decide whether we want to do a resolution of intent. And from that point on, we may have to talk about a consultant to do some pieces. Because if we spend more than a year on this, we are the slowest moving turtles. They might want to put some kind of a preservation act to keep us safe. Because there's only so much you can learn, so you just need to get it out there and say, is this something we're going to weigh for ourselves or not? And I just think that the baseline could be pulled together by our staff based on other people's experience and the studies that are there, and then we just take that part and say, are we going to move forward or aren't we? And after that, we do not spend a lot of time twiddling our thumbs. We try and put it together and say, okay, is this really going to work? And if we decide it's not, then it's not a move we make. But I think it's absolutely ridiculous to think that we shouldn't look at it because some people have the anecdotal idea that it's going to take away their freedom to choose their trash man. Seriously? That is not why other cities have done it. They aren't taking away anybody's freedom. They're trying to make a program that works, that's economical.
Mr. Nephew,
If you want to, go ahead.
you want to go jump in, Marv?
Okay, well, 15 years ago, we had the same public hearing when Gary Basham was mayor and George Rosbeck was on the council. We had one person at the meeting that was in favor of it, the rest were against it. And one person very adamantly said, he said, I know I'm paying more than my neighbor, but I'm happy with the service. And this is one of the fine lines we're walking on right now, is that some people, you talk about a love affair, people really do have a love affair of who they want to choose. They want that right to choose. That's probably one of the biggest balancing acts we have here. John made a remark earlier that made some sense. He's talked about, yes, we should have this conversation because maybe by having this conversation, we might make organized hauling better. Like you used the example of paying by the bag. Some haulers weigh the container and charge it by the weight, so you're not being charged a flat fee. So in the conversation, we might find a way to make organized hauling better. We might, at the end of the day, you might decide, but we got to. At the end of the day, let's put it this way: at the end of the day, if we find out that organized hauling is going to save the public money, then we got to make the decision. Is that do we want to do that, or do we want to? Or do we go with the fact that they're not interested in saving money and want to choose their own hauler? We got a balancing act here. But I think, have the conversation, find out if we can come up with more efficiencies, and see what happens.
You have further comment, Mr. Nephew?
Yeah. On a couple thoughts on the consultant idea, and also sort of on the timetable issue. It does seem to me that a lot of the easily accessible information, it should be fairly, I took Kathy's remark about not needing the consultant at that point to mostly mean essentially pull together maybe even only digital copies. The MPCA study, studies done by other cities that have looked at organizing in the last 5 or 10 years, and maybe sample contracts and rates from a couple of neighboring cities. I've looked at neighboring city websites. I corresponded a little bit by email with some staff. I asked somebody in White Bear Lake, for example, for a little bit of detail on the rates on their site, and confirmed that it actually includes the recycling charge. So that's an example of something where their rates seem quite low, and also because they have a city billing process, they don't have the recycling charge appearing separately the way that Maplewood residents do on our water bills. So that sort of not a really comprehensive rate study, because I know that some other people have done that, and that can take some time to do, but at least some anecdotal stuff on some of the neighboring cities that are organized, and the nature of exactly what their contracts look